All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's seminar, which is jointly sponsored by the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, or NCSA, the Center for Digital Agriculture, CDA, and the NSF Center for Research on Programmable Plant Systems, CROPS. Our guest today is a scholar whose work is at the forefront of team science scholarship. Dr. Will Barley's research is focused on understanding and facilitating collaboration across technical, disciplinary, and occupational boundaries. He's authored or co-authored over 30 publications. He also holds 2 patents from his time at General Motors Research and Design, where he worked as a researcher prior to earning his doctorate from Northwestern University's School of Communication. Dr. Barley is an associate professor of communication at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a faculty affiliate at the IGB, CSBS, and at NCSA. He's served as an advisor guiding the Carl R. Woese Institute for Genomic Biology's initiative and policy development in collaborative team-based science. While this hasn't been shared widely yet, Dr. Barley is going to also be leading a newly inaugurated initiative that brings together the Institute for Genomic Biology and the Center for Social and Behavioral Sciences with the goal of both advancing the empirical underpinnings of team science and implementing interventions to promote effective team science practices at Illinois and beyond. Along those lines, today's talk, titled Collaborative Work: How Acknowledging the Labor of Interdisciplinarity Can Facilitate Science Teams, will focus on Dr. Barley's innovative research addressing the importance of communicative labor and supportive policies in promoting effective science collaborations. Please join me in warmly welcoming my esteemed colleague, Dr. Will Barley.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Everybody on the internet, can you hear me okay? Yes, okay, good. I'm Will. It's nice to see you. And it is really an honor to be here to give this talk to this audience. I see many faces I know from many different places, and a lot of faces I don't know, and it's just really cool to be able to talk about my work to such a diverse crowd. My work, as Cabral described, centers on the work of collaboration. I'm in a communication department, and for my entire career, I've been interested in the labor, the effort that people need to enact to be able to work together with others, especially people who have different expertise from their own. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. But before I do so, I need to acknowledge that this work about interdisciplinarity is itself the product of interdisciplinary collaboration. So a lot of the empirical work that I'll be sharing with you today is stuff that I've produced in collaboration with Lee Din and Brian Allen. Lee is a computational social scientist at the University of South Florida. She's an awesome analyst and theorist of thinking about network structures. And we've done a series of studies looking at collaboration in science institutes over the past decade. And then Brian Allen, who's a bug guy, an expert in tick pathology, but also has an interest in collaboration, had a formative experience working at an interdisciplinary science institute. And when I started hanging out at the IGB, I was connected with him as someone who was thinking about issues of diversity, ecology, the challenges that ones might face when thinking about a system to facilitate diverse collaborations. And so we've actually had what's turned into a really cool generative interdisciplinary collaboration over the past several years that I'd love to share with you today. I also want to acknowledge the many research assistants and collaborators from other walks of life that have played a part in this, and specifically the researchers and staff who I can't name by name because they were my participants, but it is not possible for me to do my research without the people who have welcomed me into their lives and talked candidly with me about their experiences trying to do science and trying to enable science. Cool. So let's get started. So I want to start with a little bit of framing, talk about kind of what I see as the appeal, but also the challenges of the study of team science broadly, but also at the current moment. hopefully set up kind of why I've been doing the scholarship that I've been working on for the past 6 or 7 years. And then I'll spend the bulk of my time showing you the things that we're starting to be able to see by engaging in large-scale empirical study of interdisciplinary research institutes as a site to ask questions about whether, if, and how specific resources matter in terms of shaping scientists' collaborations over time. After we talk about that for a while, I'll close with some discussion of what I think are maybe some policy implications that are starting to come out of my work. And Cabral already kind of spoiled kind of the next steps, but the things that we're already starting to work on here at Illinois to take this work to the next level. So let's go. My guess is in this room that many of you have heard interdisciplinarity is kind of a thing. Yeah. If you've been around science for the past 50 years or so, there's been increasing calls for interdisciplinarity, teams, scientific teams, team science as a mechanism to facilitate discovery. This is a pattern that started after World War II, but has grown continually in the time since. We know from scientometric research that the science that matters, the science that addresses grand challenge issues, that actually makes a difference, that's well cited, increasingly is one, produced by teams of increasing size, and two, disproportionately is produced by diverse teams comprised of individuals who have differing expertise from one another. And this is something that sociologists of science, communication scholars, network scholars have explained largely using a logic of what we call recombinatory innovation. This is colloquially the idea that if you connect two ideas that weren't previously connected, you have a better likelihood of coming up with something new. And it turns out that this is a powerful driving mechanism for change within social systems, and it seems to be a driving mechanism underneath innovation in science. Okay? Sounds great, right? Except it's hard. And this is actually this paradox. At a system level, we know interdisciplinarity is really important, but when you look at it from an individual researcher level of analysis, the story in the literature is quite different. We know that if you are going to be an interdisciplinary collaborator, you're going to produce less stuff. So on average, your pace of productivity will be lower. We know that when you do publish, the stuff that you do publish, it might actually come to have an impact, but the time scale with which it is taken up and used by other scientists is extended. We know that if you're an interdisciplinarian, people within your home discipline have a tendency to not really get what you're doing. And this can create challenges for interdisciplinary scholars. We know that this plays itself out in grant funding. People care about funding. Interdisciplinary grants have a lower propensity of getting funded. And a lot of this stems from the point before, that review committees tend to privilege disciplinary work over interdisciplinary work, and less likelihood of getting tenure. You want to do a collaboration now? This is what my scholarship's about. Like, how do we have this system that simultaneously needs this, but also potentially punishes this sort of collaborative agreement, right? And we in communication, management, and team science have spent a lot of time trying to understand why these sorts of things are a thing. And that stems from what's in the title of my talk today, what I'm increasingly coming to call collaborative work. When you're working with someone who has on any team, but especially on a team that's full of people with differing expertise, you need to engage in all sorts of labor that you don't have to do when you're working by yourself. This is, you can broadly characterize this in two ways when you look at the literature. The first is what I would call communicative labor. So this is the work that you do to make your knowledge commensurate. You all probably, at least colloquially, have encountered the notion that when you talk or work with someone from a different background, they speak a different language from you. Communication scholars treat that very seriously. That's very meaningful to us, right? You need to learn the language of the other to be able to even start to ask questions at the interfaces of your expertise. This involves thinking about how you take ideas that are meaningful to you and represent them in a way that the other can understand. Okay? So there's work involved in building common ground, and then there's coordination work. So we know from teams researchers that when you work on a team, especially in a disciplinary team, you've got to do a lot more work to make things happen, distributing tasks, defining tasks, right? That stuff matters. And all these things kind of explain the practical side of why we see this, quote, slowdown in productivity on interdisciplinary teams. The other form of work is labor that I would call boundary work. And this has to do with the fact that when we're engaging in teams, those teams are embedded within social systems, universities, disciplines, that are full of all their own values. And so another thing that we need to manage both internally and externally when we're working on collaborative teams is who gets credit? How do we get credit? What does it mean to get credit? How do I, when I go back to my department, manage the visible utility of the work that I'm doing so I can gain credit for it? How do I manage the fact that I'm maybe teaching 4 or 5 classes while I'm also trying to collaborate with people in different groups, right? There's these politics of collaboration and the work that we're talking about here. And importantly for me, and we'll revisit this multiple times during our talk today, we have good reason to expect that despite the fact that there are skills involved in doing all this work, dominant ideologies in science and beyond tend to delegitimate this labor, right? When we talk about what expertise is, we tend to think about it as being disciplinary stuff. We tend to think less about expertise as being the capacity to look at the world from another person's perspective, when I think, and my research would suggest, that's actually a very important set of skills, an increasingly important set of skills in the modern science environment. Generally get this, I think, right? So this is all exacerbated by one of the key findings that's come out of team science in the past 20 years, which is how we talk about teams. When we talk about the work of teams, we tend to focus on what Steve Fiore calls task work, tuning the microscope, deciding the tasks that we need to do, focusing on what you might think of as being the work of science. What we don't talk about is what Fiore calls the teamwork, this stuff, right? And so one of the many reasons why this stuff is challenging is because when we talk about and train scientists about how to do science, we often focus predominantly on how to teach them to do the methods without building in space to learn these sorts of things. Okay? So that's kind of the groundwork for my talk today, and also the focus of my research program. So this is something, these sets of questions, looking at, hey, how do we take this seriously? If we know from scholarship that these sorts of labor is present and that the dominant kind of structures within the organizations where research is happening may be opposed to them, what can we do to do this? And through a series of empirical work and interventional work, I've been working on this for the past decade or so. And it's important to note that I'm not alone. So there is a wildly awesome and interdisciplinary field of team science that is focused on doing things like building theory-driven interventions designed to help teams engage in the sort of collaborative work that I was talking about earlier. There's an increasing interest in coaching, so trying to train professionals, research development professionals, to learn how to go into a team and help them build healthy and productive communication dynamics. And there's even a growing interest in understanding what organizations can do. How do we actually build policies that take this stuff seriously? My work and the work that I want to talk to you about today is right at the interface of this. So now we're kind of at the current moment. And the idea underlying my talk is actually in conversation with a report that came out of the National Academies of Science this summer. So National Academies have published a series of reports on team science over the past 20 years. And this year they published a consensus report where they said, hey, what's the state of the field? And there are a couple of findings from this report that were not all too surprising to me, but I think are really motivating for the fact that we have a lot of work to do. I'm going to show you a couple of quotes. They read all the literature, and they concluded, we actually don't know a lot about what institutions do in terms of their roles in mediating the outcomes of scientific collaborative teams. And a lot of this stems from the fact that getting good data about institutes and institutions is quite a difficult thing to come by, right? Access is notoriously tricky, right? Science teams are very impermanent, and so it can be hard to gather the sorts of empirical data we might need to be able to test assertions about whether, if, and how institutional resources make a difference. The second thing is that we haven't actually studied a lot of science teams. So most of the research underpinning the science of team science, they conclude, and this aligns with my read as well, has been drawn from other fields, predominantly management and organizational behavioral psychology. And if you look at the teams that have been studied to build much of this theory, most of these teams come from business firms, which is all well and good. We have good data about this. The theory is good. But there's good reason to think that science teams might be a different phenomenon. Right? If you think about the sorts of incentive structures, the sorts of organizational contexts, we could think of a bunch of reasons why we might expect or at least question the transferability of these theories into these contexts. But we simply just don't have the empirical data yet. which is why I labeled this portion of my talk the need for empirics in team science. We need more data about science teams, and particularly science teams as embedded within science organizations, to really be able to build actionable policy, to try and convince organizations, be they universities or funding agencies, to actually care about the stuff that we have a pretty good hunch makes a difference. We need to study science. And we should do that. And there's actually some really good places to ask these sorts of questions. So Illinois has 10 interdisciplinary research units, but they're not alone. Interdisciplinary research institutes are an organizational form that has gained in popularity over the past 30 years in science. And one of the things to me that makes them kind of a cool site to ask questions about team science is that these are organizations that are often founded under the auspice of interdisciplinarity. Their purpose, or at least as they claim, is to facilitate interdisciplinary collaboration. And many of the researchers and research teams who end up in these organizations don't only end up in them, right? They end up having affiliations elsewhere. So they are prone to be able to have to manage this sort of boundary labor that we talk about in the beginning. And if we could get access to them, it would create a really great site to do comparative work. Okay? And we do have, again, I said, a small but growing literature that suggests that these institutes might be an interesting site of study. But we need to know which resources matter, if they make a difference, and how. What are the mechanisms by which they affect scholars? And that's what I want to talk to you about in my research program. So this is a thing that me and my teams have been working on for now about a decade. And I'll tell you how we got into it in my first story for today from my research. But trying to understand the interface between the work that individuals do and the organizations within which they do that work. Shall we go? Let's go. So the first story I want to tell you about is, very quickly, is a field project that I did at a institute I will call the Computational Research Center, all pseudonyms all the time. And the thing you need to understand about the Computational Research Center is that it is an interdisciplinary research institute embedded within a large university. It's been around for 30, 40 years. And it has as its core mission to facilitate interdisciplinary research that uses computation. And I ended up at this site from an interest in collaborative work. I wanted to talk to researchers who were there and to understand what they did to build collaborations, but also to accompany that with network data. So we did interviews, but also gathered self-reported network relational data. Who do you work with? How different is their expertise from your own? How often do you interact with them? All sorts of things like that we could use to triangulate whether, if, and how enacting these strategies might affect the articulation of researchers' social relationships. And I want to give you really quickly an overview of two key findings. The first one is that when you talk to researchers at this institute, they get it. They know the work to be done, right? They know that when you're trying to build a relationship with someone else, you got to pay attention to it. You got to learn the world from the other person's perspective, and this plays out in the network data as well. When you look at interdisciplinary relationships, the thing that predicted what our measure of familiarity, cross-understanding between two disciplines, was dialogue, talking to someone. Imagine that. And this was the thing that was the strongest predictor and aligned with the interview data. Okay? So the expertise was there. The second finding was that nobody did it. This was what made me fascinated. So when people talk about this space, they say, yeah, we all know how to do this, but we can't do it. This place is full of islands, and everybody's working on their own. And this also played out in the network data. So when you look at people's social networks, they almost exclusively interact with people who they characterize as having similar expertise to their own. About a third of the researchers in our data set only talked to people on their own research teams more than once a week. And despite the fact that network data suggests that dialogue was the thing that enabled cross-understanding, people talked less with people with their connections who had different expertise from themselves, right? So there were these pressures within this organization that seemed to be inhibiting the sort of collaborative work that I'm talking about. Why? Well, it's a good thing we did interviews. And a lot of it has to do with what was going on at this organization at this point in time. So one of the things that just made me so fascinated by this was this institute at this moment in time, was involved in an effort to try and facilitate interdisciplinarity. The administration of this organization was deeply committed. They had read many of the reports that I showed you at the beginning of this talk, and they wanted to make this happen. But when you talk to the management, when you talk to administrators about how they do that, some interesting patterns showed up. So this is a quote. "It blows my mind they don't go to our website, ever. Like, we have a staff directory where you can search for people's skill sets and interests," right? They had made a social platform where you could go and you could look and see everybody's skills. And you know what? They asked people to fill it out. So they had the data up there. And they had what they call lightning talks, and they talked about open plan spaces and things like that, right? These are all well-intended things, but I hear giggles in the room, right? And that's kind of my point. What I would argue is going on here is a mischaracterization of what's actually involved in building collaborative relationships. The characterization here is one of collaboration as a process of connection, of team composition, where the work is just building the initial time. But that's not what my field suggests, right? And that's also what the researchers in this space said, right? Look, they say we need more transdisciplinarity, but the obstacles have been there forever, right? If I do this work, I'm not going to be seen as legitimate by anybody. So that was like kind of my first aha moment, was, wow, we need to be looking at this, because this is an organization that has a history of this, that's trying, but failing, not because it's not trying, but because it's not conceptualizing the labor in the way that my field would suggest this. Okay? It also was a moment where I was like, wow, this would have been a really good thing for me to ask before I started collecting these data, but the form of our data were such that we couldn't really ask these types of questions about whether, if, and how the Institute's resources might actually make a difference for researchers, which is why I went on to do another project. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about work that I've been doing over the past 5 or 6 years at another field site. We'll call it the Nature Institute. This institution is a nice comparative to the Computational Research Center because it is similar in size and scale and history. It also has a mission to facilitate interdisciplinary science through the allocation of resources to create brokering relationships on science teams. Okay? And I entered this time like I had the questions. So the first thing I wanted to do was get longitudinal. So I wanted to know whether, if, and how researchers joining this institute that ostensibly was providing resources, whether we could measure any change in their collaborative structures over time. And as you'll see, also we wanted to compare that against a control. We'll get into the weeds a little bit. I won't get too much because we only have a short period of time. And then I also talked to people because I really like mechanisms, and it's really hard to get mechanisms from these sorts of data. And I'll tell you a little bit about the findings right now. And we're going to start backwards. We're going to start with some of the stuff from the interviews. Here is the obligatory small font. We have a lot of data slide. We have the co-authorship networks of every researcher who joined the Nature Institute in its first 20 years of existence. That includes 208 individuals, 7,000 papers, 15,000 co-authors. And then we have a matched pair control group that I'll describe of you of 60 additional researchers who come from the same distribution of departments but would not go on to join the Nature Institute that we can use as a comparative group. And then for qualitative fieldwork, I had a sabbatical, and I was able to spend a year on the ground at the Nature Institute, talking with folks, not just researchers, but also staff, technicians, and administrators, which is going to be a key part of the story here in a minute. Okay. 2 themes from the qualitative data. Epistemic transformation is my word for this. It's a big word for I did different stuff. And the importance of staff and administrative labor and collaborative expertise. Okay? Here's a quote from a researcher. Think about the stories we heard at the Computational Research Center as I read this to you. The research I do now is completely different from what I thought I wanted to do when I finished my degree. The fact that the Nature Institute existed was the motivating force for me to start doing new method. It hadn't even dawned on me that these methods could be part of my life. These stories like this, were common across my interviews with researchers within this site. This idea that joining the Nature Institute didn't just provide them with resources to do their work, that being there and being in collaboration with the experts who were there led folks to fundamentally redefine what it meant to be doing their work. In this particular individual, I don't know if we have any organismal biologists in the room, but organismal biologists love their organism, right? And this actually ends up being a source of some tension when you're collaborating, because if you're working with someone who doesn't work on your organism, this can create all sorts of tensions. The weird thing at the Nature Institute is that people talk across organisms. And this particular individual was pulled in by experts who had already been hanging out there for several years, who were working on a different organism, but said, you gotta check these methods out. And when they said, I don't know how to do this, they said, come on in, we'll figure it out, right? They were pulled into this space and invited to build these relationships, okay? Lots of cool quotes like this, but trust me, please, that's there, okay? So we see at least espoused evidence of some transformation and a ton of explanations for why this is the case. So when you ask people about the resources that matter, here's a list of kind of the key things that come up. At the top, you'll see maybe some of the things that you would think of, right? So we see the sorts of things that we saw at the CRC. We see speaker series. We see some funding for pilot projects, right? We have cool technology. But the stuff that's really interesting to me is this. It's the staff and the administrators that work within this organization. People talked all the time about how the technicians, about how the budget office at the Nature Institute knew how to do interdisciplinary science, because it turns out writing an interdisciplinary grant is a meaningfully different thing than writing a unidisciplinary grant. And the staff who had worked here had developed an expertise in how to navigate these spaces. I can't not give you a quote from someone talking about this. So here's from an interview with a lab technician, who you may think of as being someone who just knows how to use the technology. But this is them talking about something really wild that they do. So when they meet a researcher who doesn't know what to do, if they say, I want to use this technology, I want to do something for the first time, I can sense that immediately. And then I call them in for a meeting. And what do I do in that meeting? The first thing I ask is, who's going to do the analysis? Let's think about the end. It's my job to make sure that from the beginning, we have a strategy that's going to result in a strong paper. The technicians and staff in this space, their job is to facilitate not only brokerage, but an understanding of the labor that's involved in building these relationships. And it's this work, this expertise that these staff members have developed that I think is part of the secret sauce in terms of what's going on here, okay? So I will pause and say, hopefully you will buy my assertion that if there ever was a place where we might see some measurable effects, it sounds like the Nature Institute might be that place. But remember the National Academy's call. We need more data. Let's see if we can do something with it, okay? This is why we had these network data. So let's get somewhat technical. We're using social network analytics here. We have, for each of our 208 plus 60 individuals, we have ego networks. So these are the networks, the social ties you have around you as an ego. We have 2 time slices. We have the 4 years before you join the Nature Institute, and we have the 4 years after you join the Nature Institute. Using some language I've learned from my ecologist friends, we can think of these as like a pond of collaboration that has a bunch of different people working within it, right, that are connected by co-authorship on papers, okay? So we have pre and post, and we can ask. Now, we have a join gap around the year you join because papers are a time-lagged product, and so we did a sensitivity analysis to figure that out. But we can look at the structures before and the structures after. And then we have a control group. So here is the distribution of the departments that are represented at the Nature Institute. And what you'll notice is it's not an even distribution. So there are some departments that are overrepresented, and there are some that are on the tail. That's going to become relevant later. But when we were finding a control group, wanted to approximate this distribution. And so we took a sample of 60 members of the Nature Institute, roughly approximating this distribution, and we went back to their home departments. Using publicly available data, we found the person who joined that department most proximately to when they did at a similar rank, but would not go on to join the Nature Institute during their career, okay? So we're trying to control for things like disciplinary identity to reapproximate this sort of stuff. We give each of these control individuals a ghost start date, and that allows us to calculate the same sort of network structures for them before and after they join. Cool? Okay. So our early results are out. They've been published in PLOS One, and I'll give you an overview of them, but I want to share with you the latest and the greatest cool stuff that I'm like really geeked about right now. But we were able to show measurable effects is the key thing. in this paper. And here are the kind of the overviews. So one thing we see is the selection effect. Researchers who end up joining the Nature Institute, when compared to the control group, tend to have a higher productivity in terms of producing more things, as well as they tend to have bigger collaboration networks, which kind of makes sense to me, right? Oftentimes it's competitive to join one of these institutes, and so you likely are chosen through a process of selection. And the second effect in terms of the size of your co-author groups, you're a collaborator. That's why you're going to a place like this, right? You're more likely to be someone who's doing team science if you're going to a team science place. But above and beyond this, we saw some other stuff. So researchers who joined the Nature Institute, when you compare time 2 to time 1, did not publish more than we would expect them to. Okay? That might be counterintuitive to some of you. But they also didn't publish less. And that's really meaningful in terms of what I told you at the beginning of the talk, right? We have good research that suggests that we might expect a decrease in productivity when you move into a space to try and explore interdisciplinary collaboration, right? So the absence of a signal here is actually kind of interesting to us. But this is the really cool stuff. Despite the fact they didn't publish more, their networks grew. All right? So it's not because they're publishing more with more people. We control for the size of authorship lists and things like that. What seems to be going on here is a growth in the articulation of researchers' networkers in terms of the diversity as measured by just the sheer number of individuals within their network, which is a gross measure, but I think one that we can use at scale. And so this shows us at least some initial evidence that what these folks are saying is happening within these interviews. It may be happening at this institute. Cool. So I was geeked about that, but I was much more geeked about art. And so I want to talk about my friend and collaborator, Julia, who's here. Hi, everybody. Julia is an artist who works at the IGB. And so I had the privilege of giving a talk at the IGB about my findings at the Nature Institute, maybe last 2 summers ago, I think is when it was. This talk was cool because it was a talk to the staff. And so I went, I had an opportunity to talk to all the staff and administration here about this finding that I shared with you about the key role that administration and staff play in enabling team science at interdisciplinary research institutes. And Julia, thank you, came to my talk. And even more thank you, came to me in like January of this year and was like, hey, Will, I make art about science. And I've never worked with a social scientist before. But do you want to make some art about this work about science institutes? And I was like, I have no idea how to do this, but let's do this, right? And so we worked together to build what you see here. This is a subset of some pieces that Julia made, drawn directly from our data at the Nature Institute. And we had an art show, a public-facing show where we got to share this art, and it was amazing. Probably one of my favorite experiences in my research career, so thank you, Julia. And also generative for my research, so meta-level interdisciplinarity, right in action, right here. So we are at this art show, and we are looking at these graphs of researchers' collaboration networks. This is the same researcher before and after they joined the Nature Institute. And we start talking about size, but then we start looking at the shape of these networks. And we say, well, doesn't this one on the right look like a little more spokey than the one on the left? Right? Yeah, technical term, spokification. And then we start talking about it, and I was like, well, actually, that's a thing that network scholars care about a lot. And remember I told you this idea of recombinatory innovation? The idea of bridging groups of individuals that don't talk to each other? It turns out that spokification is a nice measure of brokerage. It also turns out that we actually have measures of this in network studies. One of the most well-established of these is a concept called network constraint, developed by a sociologist at the University of Chicago, Ron Burt, and it has become, no joke, one of the most influential metrics of social ego networks over the past 30 years. Okay? Constraint is essentially a measure of, if I look at your network, to what extent do we expect your network ties give you access to non-redundant information? So you can have a network of the same size, like these two networks, where in one, everybody talks to everybody else, and so you don't know anything that nobody else in your network knows, right? Or you can have one of the same size where you know something that nobody else knows within this network. And it's going to be affected by size. It can be affected by brokerage, whether you're a bridge between groups, or by structural equivalence, whether there's someone else who occupies a very similar role to you. Okay? The key thing you need to understand here is this is a very well-developed construct and one that is very well established in the literature. It is probably one of the best leading indicators of performance out there. So if you have an unconstrained network, lower is going to be, quote, better for our purposes today. You are much more likely to innovate. So we have research on patents. We have research on ideas and organizations. Note, not a lot of research in science organizations for reasons said before, right? But we also know it's a great predictor of job success, raises, likelihood of promotion, and things like this. So from my standpoint, this is a cool place for us to be looking because we have a good reason to suspect it's a leading indicator of performance, which we don't really have great measures of in the data as we have so far. Okay? So the other thing we did at this conversation at the art show was talk about, okay, if this effect might be present, if we might see spokification, who's going to get it more? Is it going to be the people who are at the head of this curve? The people who are the conventionalists, the ones for whom this institute was likely built to serve, right? The ones where the technologies are best suited to be able to help answer questions around. Or is it going to be from the less conventional people, the weirdos, as I like to call them, and I am pro-weirdo, who are coming from places that are a little strange in the context of the Nature Institute, okay? And we might expect the effect to be positive there because the knowledge they're encountering at the Nature Institute is weird in reference to themselves. And so thus maybe there's an increased possibility of brokerage and innovation as a result of that. Okay? So we have these data. We spent all summer kind of recalculating. This is a non-trivial task. And we run a generalized linear mixed effects regression on this. Here are the coefficient estimates. The thing I want you to see here is that our model's a really good fit for these data. It's actually really surprised us when we started to see this. We also have a lot going on here. And the thing that has me geeked out the most is actually a three-way interaction, which, if you pay attention, is like a hard thing to interpret. So let's see if we can. So to do that, I want to show you this plot. And this is where I need to be moving, so I'm sorry. But this is for you, online people. Okay, what we have here is dotted lines and solid lines, right? On the top are the dotted lines. The dotted lines are the control group. These are people who would, in their career, not go on to join the Nature Institute. The solid lines are the researchers who would eventually go on to join the Nature Institute. The y-axis is constraint. So this is the measure of spokiness in their network, right? Lower is less constrained. Okay? Cool. Let's see. We've done dotted and solid. Now we need to do left and right. 0 is the 4 years before they joined or ghost joined the Nature Institute. And 1 is the 4 years after. Okay? And then red, which is the top line in both, if you can't see color that well, is people from the conventional departments, the head of that tail. And blue is the weirdos. I geek out hard when I look at this graphic. This is not published yet. Please don't share it, but we're really excited to share these results. So let's see what we see here. 1, main effect over time. Everybody in our sample is increasing in their social capital over time. And this kind of makes sense, right? Think about our sample. We need a 9-year history. If you don't have 9 years of history, you're going to wash out of our data set, right? You are succeeding within the broader institution where the Nature Institute is housed. And so you are gaining in your prominence, at least in terms of social capital within your network. We do see, again, a selection effect for eventual Nature Institute joiners. So people who join the Nature Institute start with a less constrained network than people who didn't. Okay? And then the thing that maybe some of you think about is, wait, maybe people are catching up, right? So the folks who are in the control group seem to be catching up to the folks who are Nature Institute joiners. But here's the funky thing about constraint. The marginal labor in terms of the change to your network that's required to decrease in constraint grows exponentially as the constraint metric goes. So it's much easier in terms of the labor of building relationships to go from 0.6 to 0.2 than it is to go from 0.2 to 0.15 or whatever that is, geometrically, okay? And so the fact that the control group catches up is awesome but it's very meaningful that we're also still seeing this growth within the Nature Institute group. And then the thing that's got me geeked out the most is this. That's a significant difference between the conventionalists and the unconventionalists. And what this shows is that the weirdos benefit more from joining the Nature Institute. You have a question?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question about that, like the weirdos versus the conventionalists, because that's very specific to this Nature
Yep.
Institute, right? So I'm curious if you or if anyone else who's doing this constraint research has looked at just disciplines
Yes.
generally to look at
Yes.
the more constraint.
Yes. You're leading my next steps beautifully, right? The limitation of this entire program is that it's a single site study, right? And the spoiler is we're negotiating access to 25 more institutes to try and do this at scale. But your question is sound, right? That maybe there's something different disciplinarily about the types of disciplines that are represented at the head of this curve than the tail, right? But there also is good theoretical reason to expect that what's going on here is brokerage, is the fact that if you come here to a place where it would be disproportionately hard for you to bridge these disciplinary boundaries, but it's an organization like the Nature Institute, remember the interview data, that pulls people in and helps them figure out how to articulate cross-disciplinary relationships, that's the space where you're going to see this difference. If this scales, note, if pans out, I think that's really interesting from a policy standpoint. And that's where we're at, okay? And where I would actually like to start addressing the question that just came up is thinking about, so what does this mean? If you buy my argument that we need empirics of studying science organizations, what are the sorts of things we could start to do if we scaled this up? One of the things that I think we should think about is collaborative work. One of the things that makes me really excited about these data is that we're beginning to be able to provide evidence that I think is compelling that we can use to try and measure the efficacy of the sorts of interventions that team science scholars have been working on for the past 15 years. If we can show measurable changes in people's networks because they're engaging in the sorts of practices that we advocate for in team science, we're going to be able to convince people, hopefully, more effectively to do them. Okay? The other thing that we can do is start to ask which specific mechanisms matter. And this is where having access to a good sample of a bunch of different institutes would be really helpful. Because institutes differ in terms of their structures, in terms of the processes, in terms of the practices, in terms of the resources that they provide. And so if we can isolate different structures, we might be able to use that to infer which types of support matter the most for which types of network articulation. Okay? So phase one is I think we can focus on collaborative work. Phase two has to do with a piece of the art that I didn't show you earlier. So every piece that Julia made was actually a triptych. We had the researchers' network before and the researchers' network after, and then we had a quote from the researchers' interview talking about how they never would have realized this change in their network without that labor of the administrators that I talked about earlier. This is something that we need to pay attention to, right? These staff are experts in how to make science happen. Are they in these networks? No. Their staff are not often attributed co-authorship on networks. We have a preponderance. We conceptualize teams as largely comprised of the PIs if we're being creative, also thinking about postdocs and maybe technicians and maybe graduate students, right? But my data suggests that we should be looking at a much more kind of embedded multiplex network comprised of individuals that have different occupational roles to understand how people interfacing with different forms of occupational experts enable innovation in science. And that's not something that we see in team science yet. We start to seeing some interest in this, but I think it's a good place to go, particularly given these quotes. So I painted a pretty rosy picture of the Nature Institute, and it is a pretty rosy place, but one of the constant challenges that these collaborative experts, these staff members face, is that even the researchers who are there, who laud them, constantly delegitimate their expertise, right? I don't feel like people care about me. Hey, you come and ask me for advice on this thing, and I'm an expert in this, and I tell you what I want to do, and then you tell me, no, I think we should go another way, right? Like, That's just your feeling, and I've been trained in this, right? To me, that screams of the fact that we need to do some work to make this work visible and valued in our organizations. And the final thing has to do with policy implications in terms of at the institution level. So if you buy the tail hypothesis, I think there's some really interesting implications for how you might recruit for a science team or a science organization. My guess is that the obvious kind of way that you would pull new people into your organization would be to look for the folks who can use the tools that you've got. That's likely to be the people at the head of this curve. And I don't think my data suggests that that's a bad strategy. We see an increase in terms of the social capital of those individuals. But one of the things that I think, if my data pan out, is really interesting is it also suggests we should be recruiting for the tail. Part of your job, if you're on a team, if you're running an institution, is to think about the people who aren't there yet that could, and pulling them in. So that's first order, but this is also a dynamic system, because that's time one. I recruit one person from this department, but now that department is more represented within my institute, right? Every time you do this, you're making that department more conventional. So this is work you always need to be doing. And that's something that I think, if this pans out, could be really useful in terms of running more effective science institutions. With a minute, I'll tell you about some work that we're doing at Illinois. Cabral mentioned this at the opening. I'm super excited. We are formally announcing an initiative, a team science, translational team science initiative that has dual goals. The first is to advance the empirics, the sort of stuff that I've talked to you about today, right? The national academies are calling for this. If we want to make a difference, we need more data and we need better data to be able to translate and extend the sorts of effects that I'm talking about here. I think I have a start, but we need more, I think, to do this. The second thing is to do something with it. So this initiative has a second mission, and I see part of some of my collaborators in the back of the room from the Center for Social Behavioral Science, where we're building training and coaching capacity on our campus that will be administered by research professionals who are trained in team science to work with recipients of small grants on campus and to offer coaching for large grants on campus to help them enact and appreciate the sort of collaborative work that we're doing here. And I'll close by just saying we're actually doing this stuff. So we have pilot programs underway, which I'm happy to tell you about if you want to ask questions. And as I mentioned earlier, we recently got tentative yeses from 25 different research institutes across the Big Ten who are at least nominally, and I have one-on-one interviews with a bunch of these directors interested in seeing if we can do something to scale this stuff up. Thank you. Cool, I'll go home. Yeah.
I've never used one of these. It's weird. Anyway, at the beginning, you said something about some of the increase in this interdisciplinary work kind of spurred after World War II. Is that right? Is that just a reference in time, or was there something that happened in World War II that caused that?
There are a couple things. One has to do with just the way that World War II operated. The US government in particular devoted a ton of money to innovation science. The Manhattan Project, right? And in many ways, it was argued, I think I saw Ned O'Gorman knows a ton about this, right? Like this, post-World War II, we see the founding of the National Science Foundation, or the growth of it into its current form, and we see this mode of funding science that relies on teams. So that's kind of, Ned, am I doing this justice? Okay, cool. There you go. Talk to him if you want about that. Yeah, was that all of your question, or do you have more? Okay. Yes.
First of all, great talk. There's a lot of stuff I'm just like nodding along, like this feels really relatable experience. I'm interested in getting your take on, you have your whole network structure and like, okay, you have a more or like a lower constraint on your network, but also going back to the motivation slides is that there's a lot of negative that can come from doing this work. And so like, is lower always better? Because I've been in one of those networks before and I'm like, I'm stretched out, like I'm burnt out. Yes. I need less of this.
Yes. That's why I said for the purposes of our talk today, this is a good thing. There's actually quite a well-established literature in network studies that suggests exactly what you said, right? Like there is labor of maintaining a brokering network, right? And this connects with the institutional challenges I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. That's what's leading to lower productivity, is people are managing this articulation. And so one of the ways that I think about and talk about this often is if you're thinking about from a policy standpoint, thinking about how do we manage, you can use a stock portfolio metaphor, right? Like, how do we manage a network that has a good amount of brokering people who are doing this collaborative work, but also disciplinarians who are embedded within cohesive networks, because cohesive networks are better at getting things done quickly. The things that they do don't tend to be as innovative because they're comprised of individuals who are really closely tied. So that's a really astute observation, yes. Yes.
Thank you for your great talk. So the leadership at the University of Illinois often talks about the interdisciplinary nature of this university, especially President Killeen said that there is something in the water, that people want to collaborate. So is this supported by the research? Are we more collaborative than other universities? Is there research around that? Can we measure that?
One could, but one would require comparative data that I don't have. And so I can't, I don't think I can answer your question the way that I think you would want me to. In terms of my personal experience, it's a part of why I came here as a scholar, is that it's the kind of campus where I can have an affiliation with the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, the Center for Social and Behavioral Sciences, and the Institute for Genomic Biology, all because these are institutes that want to think about this sort of stuff, right? So, but that's, I have a hunch, not the sort of data that you're asking for. Yes. So if we scale this up, you know, there is one of the possibilities could be a comparative thing. I kind of want to lean away from that. I want to kind of generate more actionable insight rather than making this a thing that we would compete over. If that makes sense. Yeah. Do we have any questions online? I know that we have a bunch of group there, and I want to make sure we at least give some space for that, and then we'll go here if that does good. Yeah. Okay, you got the floor.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this talk. You gave an example earlier of another institute which was making attempts at interdisciplinarity through various web platforms, you know, programming, etc. Could you talk a little bit more about where you see the difference between what was working in terms of the actual demonstrable results at the Nature Institute versus these well-intentioned efforts that weren't yielding the same fruit?
Yeah. The sorts of stuff that we saw at the first site are what I would characterize as a necessary but insufficient set of resources, right? So if you think about that quote that I showed of the person talking about, well, they want it, but they don't address the fundamental underlying issue, right? Search is a key thing in finding relationships, right? Knowing that expertise exists somewhere is a really powerful, important facet of building collaborations. But the problem in that first site was that the mechanisms they were putting in place would have worked for search, but they wouldn't have enabled actual building of relationships, right? And so what ended up happening in this particular institute was the folks who found possible relationships would go back to their project teams and tell their PI, their manager, hey, I want to build this relationship. And that person would punish them for having spent time talking to someone that wasn't on their team, right? Are you going to work in that space, right? You can have lightning talks, you can have connections and things like that, but because the institution wasn't facing the fact that it had a culture and there was the kind of other forms of resources in terms of that would actually enable the articulation of relationships, it found a dead end. And if you compare that to what's happening at the Nature Institute, it's a very different story, right? We have connection, but we're also rewarding you for engaging in dialogue and cultivating that through the way that our collaborative experts, our administration, is facilitating kind of the building of relationships. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. I think we have an online one real quick, and then, yeah.
From Sarah, I apologize if I mispronounce your last name, Lorbecki. I work in the Sponsored Programs Administration Office, focusing on post-award admin of federal grants.
Awesome.
How can my team and I help facilitate and support interdisciplinary research?
Oh, that's a great question, and thank you for coming to this talk. I love that. Post-award. Well, what are people doing post-award? They're actually doing the work, right? Anybody who's had a grant, maybe has had this moment where you're like, oh my gosh, we actually have to make this thing happen. And so one of the things that I see as a real frontier in research administration is thinking about that seriously. And one of the things that I think post-award support can do is think about how we as professionals, how you as professionals can play a role in enabling the work of doing science on these interdisciplinary teams. Example, one of the things that happens at the Nature Institute is you have PIs who come from multiple departments in multiple units across a large campus. It turns out that departments and units are kind of competitive about who gets to spend what money where, right? Because money is political. One of the things that I imagine a sponsored programs office really is in a nice position to help with is to say, stop fighting. It's all our money, right? Let's work together. How do we manage and manage and navigate these differential kind of structures across units on campus? My suspicion is that the folks in a post-award office know that better than anybody else. To realize that, I also would go out on a limb and suspect we would need to legitimate the expertise of individuals in these spaces too. Not treat them the ways that the research that our staff members in these quotes are characterizing them as, right? Because despite the fact that they know that, if the researchers don't acknowledge and value that expertise, they're not going to take advantage of it, right? So I would say you already had the expertise. Our work with the researchers and research teams is to help them see and understand how to empower and use your skills to their benefit. Do we have time for one last thing? You had your hand up earlier. Yeah. Let's go.
Good. All right.
Yep.
Yeah. So my question is, it seemed like one of the things that were for the teams that were really working was the quality of the support, the research technology support, the research development support. I'm curious if in your work you found how they got there, how they got to being of that quality that was allowing them to provide what everyone needed. That's the space that I work in. I'm out of the office of the CIO, so super interested in learning how to make those teams work.
Yeah. I mean, in this particular institute, it's a mix of intention and luck, right? I think a lot of it stems from the ways that the individuals who founded it and built it, their orientations towards facilitating interdisciplinary work, and their vision for how to build an institute that would do that, right? So this value for exploration and building and valuing this sort of work was there from the beginning, right? Which I think is a thing that comes out in research on innovation organizations, is founders matter and these sorts of things, right? The other thing that works in this institute's interest is they were successful in corralling a ton of resources early on. And so they were able to build a pretty large dedicated network. And not all these institutes have this. In fact, most institutes don't have the same level of endowment as this one does, right? If my work pans out and it shows that this stuff is useful, one of the things I hope for is that we can advocate for resource allocation like this, so that it doesn't just happen in places where it happens by accident, but it can happen in a reasoned way by dedicating financial and human resources to this sort of skill.